A container comes off a ship and a clock starts. Leave it too long and somebody is billed for the time it spent standing still. Between 2020 and 2022, 9 carriers billed close to $9 billion in charges of that kind. About $2 billion of it was never paid. Both of those figures come from the same place, and it is not a trade group or a lobbyist. They are printed in the background section of a federal rule, cited to the regulator's own records as the reason the rule was necessary. That rule is the subject of this episode. It does not abolish the charge. It does something stranger and, once you see it, more interesting. It makes the bill itself the point of failure. The charge has 2 names, and the difference between them is where the box is standing. If the container is still inside the port, on the terminal's ground, past the time you were allowed, the charge is called demurrage. You are occupying space that the terminal needs for the next ship. If you have taken the container away and are still holding it, the truck chassis and the box itself out at your warehouse, the charge is called detention. You are holding equipment the carrier needs back. Same idea, 2 locations. One is rent on ground you are standing on. The other is rent on a steel box you have not returned. Both start after a period called free time, which is exactly what it sounds like. A number of days, agreed in advance, during which the clock does not run. It is worth defending the charge before examining it, because a story that starts from outrage gets this wrong. A container terminal is a car park with a very fast turnover and no spare space. Every box sitting on it is occupying a slot that the next ship needs, and ships do not wait. A shipping container is likewise a piece of equipment that has to come back and go out again to earn anything. Without a clock, the cheapest place to store goods in America would be the dock they arrived on. Everyone would leave everything there, the terminal would fill, and the port would stop. The charge exists to make sitting still expensive, so that things move. That is a real function, and nobody sensible disputes it. The dispute is about something else. Here is the difficulty that makes the whole subject contentious. The clock measures how long the box stood there. It does not measure why. Suppose the terminal has no appointment slots available for a week. Suppose the chassis you need to move the box is not there. Suppose a strike, a storm, or a computer system that will not release the container. In all of those cases, the box sits and the clock runs, and at the end of it, the bill arrives. The bill is calculated from the time, and the time is not necessarily anything the person paying could have changed. That is not a hypothetical grievance. It is the specific thing the federal regulator went and looked at. And notice the structural oddity in it, because it is what makes this different from an ordinary late fee. With most penalties for lateness, the person being charged controls the thing they are late with. You returned the book late. You paid the invoice late. The charge is aimed at behavior you could have altered. Here, the party paying frequently does not control the terminal gate, does not own the chassis, does not schedule the appointment, and cannot enter the yard. They are being charged by the day for the performance of a system they are a customer of. That is not automatically unjust. Somebody has to bear the cost of a slot being occupied, and the alternative is that the terminal bears it and prices it into everything instead. But it does mean the charge cannot be defended the way a late fee is defended, and once you notice that, the shape of the eventual rule stops being surprising. American ports in those 2 years are the closest thing recent history has to a stress test. Import volumes rose sharply. Terminals filled, ships waited offshore, and the number of days a container spent motionless went up everywhere. And because the clock measures days, the charges went up with them. The regulator's own summary of the period, printed in the rule as its justification, is this. Over that 2-year window, 9 of the largest carriers serving American trades individually charged approximately $8.9 billion in demurrage and detention. 9 carriers. 2 years, not the whole industry, and not 1 year, and the difference matters if you are going to repeat the figure. The same sentence carries a second figure, and it is the one that stopped me. Of that 8.9 billion charged, the carriers collected roughly 6.9. $2 billion was billed and not paid. That is about 22% of everything invoiced, and it happened before any of the rules in this episode existed, which tells you that the disputing was already happening, at scale, in whatever ad hoc way the parties could manage. I want to be careful here, because the gap is the most quotable thing in this episode, and it is very easy to overread. 2 billion unpaid does not mean 2 billion wrongly charged. The document reports the two figures and does not explain the difference between them. There are at least 3 ordinary reasons a bill goes unpaid. It was disputed, and the dispute succeeded. It was written off as part of a wider commercial relationship because the carrier wants the customer next year. Or it was simply never going to be collected from somebody who could not pay. Which of those dominates is not in the source, and I am not going to guess. What the gap does establish is that the billing was contested enough, and often enough, to leave a $2 billion hole in it. It is worth sitting with how unusual that is as a business fact. Imagine any other invoice line where a fifth of what you bill simply does not arrive, year after year, and you carry on billing it the same way. Most companies would either fix the billing or stop offering the thing. Neither happened, and the reason is that the charge is not really a product. It is a lever for making people move containers, and a lever works whether or not the money at the end of it is collected. A bill that goes unpaid still made somebody hurry, which also explains why the regulator's attention landed where it did. If the purpose of the charge is partly to be threatened rather than collected, then the accuracy of the threat is the thing worth regulating. The regulator did not arrive at a rule directly. It ran an inquiry first. And the inquiry has a name that tells you how these things actually work. Fact-Finding Investigation Number 29. In July of 2021, the officer running it, Commissioner Rebecca Dye, issued interim recommendations. Among them was a suggestion that the Commission ask the industry whether carriers and terminals should be required to include certain minimum information on the bills they send, and to follow certain practices when sending them. Read that recommendation carefully and notice what it is not. It does not propose capping the charge. It does not propose banning it during congestion. It proposes rules about the invoice. That is the hinge of this whole story. And at first glance, it looks like a bureaucrat choosing the smallest available lever. In 2022, Congress passed a shipping law that made parts of it mandatory. The regulator was no longer deciding whether to act. It was carrying out an instruction. That distinction matters for how much weight to give the result. A rule an agency writes because it wants to can be quietly reversed by the next set of commissioners. A rule it writes because a statute told it to is harder to unwind. The final rule appeared in the Federal Register on the 26th of February 2024. It had taken about 16 months from the first published draft, which itself came a year and a bit after the recommendation. Roughly 3.5 years from noticing the problem to a rule about invoices. The rule does several things. The first is the least glamorous and probably the most consequential. It says who may be sent the bill. There are exactly 2 candidates. The party who contracted for the transport or storage of the cargo, or the consignee, meaning the person the cargo is ultimately being delivered to. And it adds a condition that sounds trivial and is not. The bill may not be issued to more than one of them at the same time. Consider what the alternative looks like from the inside. The same charge for the same container arrives at the importer and at the freight forwarder and at the trucking company. Each of them can reasonably say it is not theirs. Each of them can also reasonably pay it in order to get the box released and then argue afterwards. Under those conditions, the strongest position belongs to whoever is holding the cargo, and the person most likely to pay is whoever most urgently needs it. That is not the same thing as whoever owes it. Requiring a single named billed party does not make the charge fair. It makes it addressed. Somebody specific is being asked and can therefore specifically refuse. The difference between those two situations is larger than it sounds, because a dispute needs a defendant. When 3 parties each receive the same demand, None of them is quite the person who owes it, and the practical resolution is whoever blinks. Nothing about that process produces a decision. It produces a payment from the party with the least tolerance for delay, and then the matter ends because the money has moved. When one named party receives it, refusing is a position rather than an evasion. There is a bill addressed to them that they say they do not owe, and the disagreement now has two sides and a document between them. That is the shape a dispute has to have before any of the later provisions in the rule can do anything at all. Everything about deadlines and required statements assumes there is one person on the other end of the argument. One detail in that provision was not in the draft. The original proposal named only the party who had contracted for the transport. The final rule added the consignee as an alternative. That is a small edit with a real consequence. It widens who can be billed. A rule commonly described as a win for cargo owners quietly made it permissible to bill the receiver of the goods, who may have signed nothing at all. Rules are negotiated documents, and the interesting parts are usually the differences between the draft and the final version, rather than the press release about either. There is a defensible reason for the change, and it is worth stating fairly. Cargo frequently moves under arrangements where the party that signed the transport contract is an intermediary who has long since been paid and has no continuing interest in the box. If the only billable party is that intermediary, a charge for a container sitting in a yard can become unbillable to anyone who is actually in a position to move it. So widening it to the receiver of the goods is not obviously a favor to carriers. It may equally be the only way the charge reaches somebody who can act on it. But the effect is still that a person who signed nothing can be billed, and that is a real change made between the draft and the final text, in a rule generally reported as tightening the rules on carriers. Both readings are available, and the document supports both. The rule then puts clocks on the paperwork, which is a satisfying symmetry for a charge that is itself a clock. There are time frames for issuing an invoice, for disputing it, and for resolving the dispute. The one to remember is the second. A billed party has 30 calendar days from the date the invoice was issued to contest the charge. 30 days to argue, not 30 days to pay. If you have ever received a bill you believed was wrong and then let it sit while you gathered your evidence, you can see the trap in that immediately. Now, the provision that made me read the document twice. The rule sets out a list of information that must appear on the invoice. Dates, amounts, the usual identifying details. And then, two statements that the biller has to make. The first is a statement that the charges are consistent with the Commission's rules on demurrage and detention. The second is a statement that the carrier's own performance did not cause or contribute to the charge being billed. Read that again. In order to invoice you for the time your container stood still, the carrier must assert, on the invoice, that it was not their fault that it stood still. Most consumer protection works by giving you a right to complain afterwards. This works differently, and it is worth appreciating. By putting the claim on the invoice, the rule converts a vague grievance into a specific written assertion by a named party. Before, you would argue that the delay was the terminal's fault, and they would argue it was not, and there was no fixed text to point at. Now there is a sentence, printed by them, saying it was not. It does not settle who is right. It creates something that can be wrong, which in a dispute is worth a great deal more than an argument about circumstances. The same technique appears wherever a regulator has to police behavior it cannot observe directly. You do not audit every transaction. You require a signed statement about it, and then the falsity of the statement becomes the thing you can act on later. There is also a quieter effect, upstream of any dispute. Somebody inside the carrier now has to be willing to attach that sentence to a particular bill. In marginal cases, where the delay obviously did involve the carrier's own scheduling, that is a small internal friction, at exactly the point where the charge is least defensible. Whether that friction is large enough to change behavior is not something the document can tell you, and I have no evidence either way. But it is the mechanism the rule is relying on, and it is a different mechanism from a penalty. And here is the part that makes the whole approach make sense. If a demurrage or detention invoice does not include the required information, the rule states that the failure eliminates any obligation of the billed party to pay the charge. Not reduces, not delays, not creates a right to complain. Eliminates. An incomplete bill is not a bill that can be corrected into enforceability after the fact. On its face, the obligation to pay it does not exist. Go back to the moment where the regulator, looking at billions of dollars of contested charges during a national supply chain crisis, decided to write rules about the format of invoices. It looks like the least ambitious thing available. It is not. Capping the charge would have required deciding what the right price for occupying a terminal slot is, which nobody knows and which changes hourly. Banning it during congestion would have removed the pressure to move boxes at exactly the moment it was most needed. Regulating the invoice does neither. It leaves the price alone and attacks the enforceability, which means the party sending the bill now has to be able to defend it in writing before it is worth anything. That is a lever on the process rather than on the number, and it is available precisely because the charge is not paid at a till. It is invoiced. Several things, and they matter. It does not cap the charge. A carrier may bill whatever its tariff says. It does not abolish free time or lengthen it. How many days you get is still commercial. It does not say the delay was anybody's fault. It requires a statement about fault. It does not adjudicate one. And it does not mean these charges have stopped. The clock still starts when the container lands. One more, and it is the detail that separates reading a document from reading about one. The rule took effect on the 28th of May, 2024. Almost every account of it says exactly that and stops. The document says something slightly different. It takes effect on that date, except for two specified provisions, which were delayed, with the Commission to announce their effective dates separately. So there was a period in which the rule everybody was describing was partly not in force. That is not a scandal, and it is not unusual. It is simply what the document says, and it is available to anyone who reads 2 sentences further than the headline. The same document also notes that the shipping law authorizes the Commission to revise the required invoice contents in later rulemakings, and requires it to start another one on prohibited practices. This is a stage, not an ending. None of this makes the underlying tension go away, and it is worth being clear about why. The terminal needs the box gone. The carrier needs the box back. The importer needs the goods. And when the system is congested, all three of those are impossible at once, which is exactly when the charges are largest and the fault is least clear. A rule about invoices does not add appointment slots or chassis or berths. It decides who has to be able to justify a bill and what happens to the bill when they cannot. That is a smaller thing than fixing a port. It is also the only one of those a regulator can actually do with a document. So here is what is underneath the story the next time congestion is in the news and somebody mentions the cost of delays. There is a charge that runs by the day, and it does not ask why the day was lost. Over one 2-year period, 9 carriers billed nearly $9 billion of it, and about $2 billion went unpaid, which tells you how contested it already was. The federal response was not a price cap. It was a requirement that the bill name one party, arrive with a clock on it, and carry a written statement from the carrier that the delay was not their doing, and that a bill missing any of it is not a debt. The clock still starts when the container lands. What changed is that somebody now has to sign for it.